Alright, when you initially launch Mudbox, this is what you're going to see. Now, this welcome screen allows me to look between Mudbox's built-in learning movies. There's some tutorials built in. I can go to the Mudbox community to see tutorials, and it also shows me the models that Mudbox ships with. So as I scroll through here, I can see some of the basic models that Mudbox does ship with. More meshes will take me to the Mudbox community site, where I can download even more free models for Mudbox. So as I look at this, we're going to start with the sphere. When I click on the sphere, it's going to load it up into the Mudbox display window, into the 3D view. And now as I look at the Mudbox interface, at the very top of the screen here, this row of icons, this row of menus is considered to be the main menu. Right below that, I have a set of tabs for the 3D view, the UV view, my image browser, and the Mudbox community site. Go back to our 3D view. On the right side of the screen, here I can see I'm in the Layers palette, or the Layers tab, and in the Layers tab I have a Sculpt and a Paint button. Now, the Sculpt and Paint button both allow me to have multiple layers on my object. With Paint, there's a lot of different ways that I can have layers. I'm not going to actually start there yet, but just know that Paint allows me to have a lot of similar types of layers as I can have in Photoshop, with similar types of blending modes. The object list shows me all the different objects in my scene, and Viewport Filter allows me to do some pretty cool things with like depth of field and ambient occlusion. And we'll get into all that stuff later. So back to our layers, and now at the very bottom of my screen over here, I have my tools. So right here I see Sculpt Tools, and within the Sculpt Tools, there are a lot of different types of brushes. As I hover over, you can see it'll actually give me a flyout that gives me a little bit of an explanation of what's going to happen with that brush. So then I have Paint Tools, Posing Tools. So within Mudbox, once you have a character, you can actually create joints within it and pose it. So the idea there is that even though it's posed into an asymmetrical shape, as I paint on one arm or one leg, it's still going to do the exact same thing on the opposite leg. Generally speaking, I wouldn't use Mudbox for much as far as posing goes, because once I bring that mesh back into like 3ds Max or Maya, I want it in its T-pose for adding bones and rigging. So it's a cool thing to be able to have in Mudbox for creating concept art, but not necessarily for the final sculpting. So within the pose tools, it also allows me to actually change the weights and move pivots around once I've actually created joints. I also have select and move tools, so if your object in Max or Maya are not created on the center line of the world, you may need to actually go into objects and move them into the center of the world so that things like within my sculpt tools, if I click on my sculpt brush, and I want to use mirroring so that I actually sculpt on both sides of the object at one time, I'm going to be able to actually do that. Otherwise, the x-axis is based on the world's axis. So, in local x, local y, local z will usually work, but it is better when you're sculpting your object to begin with, or modeling your object to begin with, to keep it on the very center line of that world, either Max, Maya, Softimage, whatever it may be. So, there again, that's the properties window that will give me the properties for any of the brushes and or paint tools. So if I click on the paintbrush, here I see the properties change to the properties for the paintbrush. Pencil, it's all there. So I can sample the color off of an object. And then when I go to paint, it'll actually allow me to create a paint layer, and I can change different channels for what I'm going to put that in. Right now we're just going to cancel. Alright, so you can see when my x-axis for sculpting or painting or whatever is on, I see on both halves of the mesh that I have the paintbrush, and on the opposite side the little dot that represents the center of the brush that's going to be drawing or painting on the other side. Down here, we can see all of our stamps, stencils, brush fall-offs, material presets, lighting presets, and camera bookmarks. Now right now there are no camera bookmarks, but within the stamps and stencils, you can use these to sculpt and paint on your objects. Same with stencils. They're used a little bit differently, but they're all for actually using to sculpt and paint on your object. Now the fall-off controls definitely the kind of softness of the way the brush works. Material presets, I can basically load different base materials onto my object for working with. Now, generally speaking, I probably wouldn't want to sculpt a reflective object just because it's a little bit harder to actually see the surface. When I'm sculpting an object, I do tend to use the white gesso. For me, it allows me to see the surface a little bit more accurately. Some of these, though, as cool as they are for certain looks in your viewport, not real great for actually sculpting on the object. Chalk is a little too bright, gesso gives me a little bit more of a shadow. But again, some of these, like the light bulb, just don't really give you the ability to see the surface well enough that you can sculpt it accurately. So the default is a pretty good one. Personally, I like the gesso though. So as far as that goes, you also have lighting presets, and if you change these, so I'm going to tell it not to show me that again. I know it's going to remove the existing lights, but there is a default setting that we can always go back to. So one of these, if I find it in here, there it is, default. And just switch back and it'll go back to the default lighting that was in the scene. So some of these are pretty cool, but again, I probably wouldn't use them for actual sculpting. I would probably use them for rendering at the end, because Mudbox does allow me to render an image out at the end of my sculpting process. But the default lighting is, in my opinion, going to be the best one for actually doing my sculpting. It's not too harsh, it's not too bright, it allows me to see the surface quite accurately. Alright, so that is the intro to the interface, and the next one we're going to get into actually using some of those sculpt tools and some of those paint tools.